I learned something a few years ago about my great-grandfather, James Shepheard. I don't think my family had ever heard the story about him being involved in a shipwreck on the coast of Cornwall, England. Uncovering the event was a surprise and a learning experience about the man, the event, the area, and the information sources available. In July 1910, James had just finished making several trips on the steamship Innismore, which delivered coal between ports in Wales, France, and Spain from February to July of that year. Having completed that assignment as a steward, 45-year-old James signed on for the same position with the crew of the steamship Wimborne on the 25th of August 1910 at Berry Island near Cardiff, Wales. Wimborne was a steamer of about 3.5 tons and measured 340 feet in length with a 46-foot beam width and 25-foot in draft. It had been built in 1898 by Richardson Duck and Company at Thornaby-on-Stockton-on-Tees and was owned by Evan Thomas of Radcliffe and Company Limited. Everything pointed to another routine trip, such as James had been involved in for over a decade. But this voyage was to have a shocking and memorable ending. On its first leg, the Wimborne sailed from Cardiff on the 31st of August 1910 through the Strait of Gibraltar to the Dardanelles in Turkey, arriving there on September 15th. On the 28th, they made their way to Kherson in the Ukraine, arriving there on October 2nd. A brief stopover was made as well at nearby Odessa on October the 9th to pick up a cargo of wheat. On the next day, the ship was on its way home. They made port in Rotterdam, Holland on October 30th. There, the wheat was unloaded and most of the crew discharged. For the voyage home from Rotterdam, many of the crew from the first leg of the trip signed on again, plus 4 apprentice sailors. James was one of the group, probably anxious to get home after over 2 months at sea. With its cargo unloaded and its hold now empty except for water ballast, the Wimborne put to sea on Friday, November 4th. The trip would take the ship around Land's End in Cornwall back to Cardiff. In a few days, everyone would be home. But a major storm was brewing. Everything went well until Sunday evening. Then the ship began encountering difficulty navigating through rough seas with no cargo to keep it deeper in the water and steady. The lights at Lizard Point were sighted about 8 p.m. By then, the wind was blowing at moderate gale force from the northwest. The master reported that they were abeam of the Wolf Rock light by 2:30 a.m. in the morning when they changed course to run toward the Longship's light. By 3:45 a.m., the vessel was apparently nearing Land's End, but the helm was no longer responsive and the Wimborne began drifting dangerously toward land. She struck the rocks at about 4:30 a.m. below Carnberra. It was impossible to get at the distress signal rockets, as they were in the part of the vessel that became submerged. Flares were found and burnt, however. Greatly to the relief of those on board, their signal was answered from the Admiralty lookout at Tolpeden, just over a mile to the southeast. The officer of the lookout immediately rang up Sennen Cove and Penzance and asked for assistance. The message was received by the Sennen Coast Guard shortly before 5 a.m., and without the least delay they had collected their rocket apparatus and were rushing to the scene. They arrived there about 6 a.m. From the time the vessel struck, the sea began dashing it in against the cliffs, accompanied by heavy rain. The Wimborne's anchors were thrown out, and for a while these steadied her a little. The stern was submerged almost immediately as wave after wave broke clean over her whole length. The crew took refuge on the forecastle deck, somewhat beyond the reach of the waves, with the bridge acting as a breakwater. Their position was perilous, as in addition to the imminent prospect of the vessel going to pieces, the tide was rising, lifting the ship further onto the rocks. Although only a few yards from the headland, there was no possibility of the crew getting ashore by their own efforts, as between them and the shore there was a raging gulf of water and jagged rocks. A boat was not an option due to the heavy waves crashing against the shore. Their only hope, therefore, lay in deliverance from the land. A number of people from the Admiralty station at Tolpeden and the village of Porthguara also made for the wreck. the Coast Guardsmen taking with them cliff ladders and hand lines. The vessel was not sufficiently close to land, though, for the cliff ladder to be of any service. The force of the gale was also so great that they were unable to throw the hand lines on board from the cliffs. The position of the men on the doomed ship was increasingly dangerous. Everything on deck was being washed away, including the lifeboats. The mainmast snapped and went overboard, and the vessel broke in two amidships. At any moment, she might have gone completely to pieces. The brigade of the Sennin Cove Coast Guards took up a somewhat sheltered position slightly to the westward of Cairnbarra Point, and with their first shot, they landed a line on the Wimborne. This was made fast to the steamer's bow. But the work of rescue was by no means easy, as the ship continued to vigorously sway to and fro in the breakers. Utmost care had to be exercised to prevent the lines from the life-saving brigade from snapping. The 4 apprentices on board would be sent ashore first. The rest of the crew and officers would follow, the captain and the chief officer being the last to leave. It was decided to accelerate the landing of the men and bring them ashore 2 at a time. The rescue proceeded quickly. As one of the men was hauled ashore, he immediately ran to the lifeline and lent a hand in saving his companions. As there was no lack of willing helpers, others followed in quick succession, each immediately being pulled up the cliff to safety. When the captain and the mate were safe on shore, all of the crew and rescuers celebrated. The shipwrecked mariners were taken to farmhouses in the vicinity where they received food, water, and warm clothing. They were split into groups and put up at the Sawa Farm, Roskastal, Trevian, and Porthquara. Within days, the entire crew had been repatriated to Cardiff. The ship and its end would become just a memory. The sea eventually claimed the vessel, leaving no trace of her, as it has done for so many hundreds of others. Before that time, though, a formal investigation was held at the Cardiff Law Courts on the 13th to 16th of December 1910 concerning the loss of the Wimborne. Information was sought as to the vessel's construction, history, state of repair, and particulars of the fateful voyage. The findings of the court were that in spite of the hazardous sea conditions, the ship was not navigated with proper and seamanlike care, and the neglect of the master was a contributory cause of the loss. It was concluded that the captain had not given heed to the warnings conveyed by signals from the longship's light, which clearly indicated the Wimborne was off her course and too close to the shore. While the destruction of the ship was inevitable, the rescue of the entire crew of 27 men was effected by means of the promptitude, skill, courage, and resources of the Coast Guardsmen of Sennin and their neighbors who assisted them. The conduct of the Coast Guardsmen was praised and honored by the court. In retrospect, it's surprising that my great-grandfather had not experienced more disasters on his many voyages. Before his joining the crew of the Wimborne, he had already sailed on at least 8 other steamships and visited ports in South America, North America, and around Europe. The shipwreck did not put him off sailing, though, as he joined 2 more crews before immigrating to Canada in 1913. All the vessels he sailed on were steam-driven cargo ships and very similar in design. I was more than curious about each of the ships and the trips he took and started looking for more information about them. There's a significant amount of data about cargo ships, including those that were wrecked or otherwise sunk, on the wrecksite.eu website. There, besides the information on how they were lost, you can find out about their construction, ownership, registration, size, and propulsion. You can also see photographs of the vessels for many of them, as I've shown here for the Wimborne. I first learned that James Shepheard had worked as a ship's steward in reviewing the passenger list of the SS Scania when he immigrated to Canada in 1913. He'd visited the U.S. as a crew member on at least one earlier date. His personal Bible was shown to have been purchased in New York in 1912 while he was there and working on the SS Usk. That information inspired me to begin searching out more about his career at sea. I was alerted to information about crew lists by a friend and his contact at the Ship's Nostalgia website. The site has a forum on which one can ask questions about various maritime activities and research. I'm very appreciative that they advised me of how to search for and obtain any available records. I started naturally with obtaining information about the SS Usk. I was able to obtain a copy of the crew lists with James' name on it from the Glamorgan archives. They showed he had sailed on 3 voyages with the Usk in 1911 and 1912. The document also recorded the previous ship on which James had sailed, the Manchester. That started me looking backwards in time with other searches. Using the crew lists, it was not long before I found his connection with the Wimborne and then with other ships. I'm presently actually still looking for trips he made in 1903 and earlier. One of the important websites for finding crew lists is the Crew List Index Project. CLIP is a not-for-profit volunteer group set up to assist research into the records of British marine seafarers of the late 19th and early 20th century. On this site, you can search for ships and seafarers, as well as dozens of document types related to both. It's a great start to merchant marine research. For individual voyages or years, the index will show which archives the records are available from and for which years. There are transcripts of crew lists for some voyages and some ships. A search for crew lists for the Wimborne, for example, shows all the archives where such records may be stored. The cost to obtain copies of documents from all these source sites is very reasonable. Glamorgan Archives holds crew lists for ships registered in the port of Cardiff. I've used their services to find data about several steamers on which James served. CLIP will also show information for ships registered in other areas and which archives will be relevant. Maritime History Archive is located at Memorial University in Nova Scotia, Canada. For a particular ship, a search will show for what years they hold crew lists. It will indicate what other archives offices also hold crew lists for the same ship and for what years, in this case for the Wimborne. The National Maritime Museum, part of the UK's Royal Museums in Greenwich, holds crew lists for only certain years, mostly those divisible by 5. And of course there's the National Archives. Again, this site will only hold some records for some ships. It's worth doing a search though in any case. Around the 250-mile-long coast of Cornwall, England, can be found remnants of wrecked ships numbering in the thousands. The bones of once proud vessels bear witness to their violent endings. Interestingly, Cairnberra, where the Wimborne met its end, is now a popular climbing site on the southwest coast of Cornwall. It's been an amazing journey of my own into finding information about merchant mariners, and in particular about my great-grandfather, who also later in life showed his penchant for new and challenging ventures. But those are stories for another time.